I appreciate it's in the middle of your day or the start of your day for most of you. So yeah, very much appreciate this. And yeah, we'll get right started. Before I do, though, I'll just quickly introduce myself and our project. My name is John Luk Chua. I am the Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Specialist on the Asia CTIP project, USAID Asia CTIP project. We're a regional counter-trafficking in persons project, and we are in year 8, going into year 9 of implementation. We're based in Bangkok, many of you will know, and I'm also very glad to see some familiar faces online today. So just before we begin, some very quick housekeeping rules. If I can get the slide show up, please. Thank you. Can I have the next slide, please? Perfect, thank you. So just very quick housekeeping. Just a reminder, we'd appreciate if you're not speaking to mute your laptops, computers. If you do have a question, please do feel free to put it down in the chat. During Q&A, again, feel free to use the chat function or raise your hand and unmute yourself. And also, yeah, please do connect. Introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us which organization you're from. Let us know what you think about some of our findings that we'll be discussing today, because there'll be quite a lot of research findings being discussed. Next slide, please. So today's webinar will cover quite a few things, so do bear with us. We'll also try to make it as interactive as possible, with, as I mentioned, opportunities for questions. Firstly, just a bit of background. Over the years, our project, the USAID Asia CTIP project, has led quite a lot of evidence generation and research projects. And this has led to or resulted in quite a wealth of sort of 4P theme publications. Today, we'll be discussing 2 protection-themed publications, focusing specifically on reintegration. One of those will look at specifically reintegration perspectives or reintegration from the perspectives of trafficking survivors, based on research conducted with our partners, the Humanity Research Consultancy. And the other is a systematic literature review, which we recently published, looking at the effectiveness of sport-based programming for victims of trauma. These studies shed light on very pressing issues to do with protection and reintegration, and we do believe that these findings can spark valuable discussions around this thematic, and hopefully moving forwards inspire protection programming in CTIP which reflects the real needs and wants of survivors of trafficking. So without much further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists for the first discussion. I have with me today Mina Chiang, who is the founder and director of the Humanity Research Consultancy, which is a social enterprise led by local experts, which provides research, training, and consultancy services to governments, NGOs, and the private sector across multiple issues, including trafficking persons. Secondly, we have Eric Kasper, who is a senior consultant at the HRC, and who was the lead researcher for this project on reintegration, which we conducted about 4 years ago. And he's also led many other research projects in collaboration with the Asia CTIP project. Mina and Eric, thanks for joining us once again. I think this is the 3rd time we've done this. So very happy to be able to finish off, I guess, this cycle of discussing protection-themed publications with actually going back to the first one, which we did. So it's a bit like Star Wars, I guess, maybe. Before I dig into the findings, I have very sort of maybe a background question for you. In fact, you guys actually started this research before I joined. So what was actually the motivation behind this piece, and how was it designed?
You want to go first, Eric? Sure. Yeah, so basically, Mina and I have been working together for a number of years, and we've worked across a number of issues about, why bad things happen, why things keep happening, even though there's kind of a consensus that they should stop. Why are these challenges so entrenched? What is it that keeps driving them forward? And so we had this opportunity with Winrock to dig into the issue of counter trafficking, of human trafficking. And so we wanted to design this in a way to really capture that systemic aspect. And in so doing, because survivors and those who experience trafficking occupy such an important part of that system, we wanted to center their voices, center their experiences as well, in order, to genuinely shift the focus onto what those most affected experience, and also to most rigorously sort of learn about how those dynamics affect people. Yeah, so we've noticed that a lot of research on trafficking that touches on reintegration kind of assumes that we know what is needed, assumes that we know the challenges of reintegration, and even the research that digs into survivors' experiences, it tends to emphasize the challenges. It's like, let's ask survivors what they need, let's ask survivors what they're going through, but it's never really what does it even mean to do better? What does it even mean to find success at this point? And to be radically open to things like, actually maybe people need to remigrate, or actually, people don't want what we have the resources to give them, or they need things we can't provide. So that was the motivation, and we tried to design the research to get at those things.
Yeah,
Mina,
maybe
you
I
want to
will
add
just
anything?
add another 3 points. So I think the title of our briefing is called Survivors' Perspective on Successful Reintegration, not government's perspective and not NGO's perspectives. That is very much centered on survivors' voices. And I think as we can imagine, there might be some alignment, but also some disalignment. And it is indeed that when we try to listen very carefully, survivors' ideas, there are certain things that we realize, oh, it's actually maybe what government cares a lot about. They don't really care that much, but there are other aspects, perspectives that very, very important to that, and that constitute what they consider as a successful reintegration. For example, being able to support themselves financially, and beyond that, their families as well. So not just them individually, but the kind of unit of the circle, it's the family. So that's the first one on survivors' perspective. So the second one is we tried, so Eric and I were both did some previous research using this methodology more around like systems practice. So we try to kind of not just find things in a kind of a linear, cause and result type of direction, but very much seeing a lot of complex issues into a system and trying to be able to document them, be able to describe them. So kind of like in the end, visually will look a bit like a web. And so that's also something that we try to implement this idea in understanding the reintegration using the systems method. The third one is that when we started designing this research, we very much wanting to make it more participatory. So using the participatory action research. So the very, very initial design was actually letting survivors holding cameras using video storytelling to be able to really showcase their perspective, not just on kind of words and written format, but even on the image level. But that was a few years ago, as Jean-Luc mentioned. So that was just right before COVID hit. So we started the whole research at the end of 2019. So when we went to Cambodia to start training the trainers, teaching them how to use video storytelling, then COVID hits, that make us not able to really continue this process and have to adopt that and using a little bit, a slightly more compromised method. But we're still pretty much happy with the result. We still managed to get a lot of voices from survivors, but there was a little bit of a change there. Yeah. So I guess back to you, Jean-Luc.
Thank you. No, thanks for that. And I'm really keen to dig into what you mentioned, Eric, on the systems and the systems sort of theory approach that you employed in the study, and also, Mina, what you touched on, sort of the methods you use and the more participatory ones. But maybe for our audience who haven't read the paper or the brief, I hope you do read the brief afterwards, because we've condensed, I think, a 35-pager into something like 10. So please do at least read that. Which studies did you look at for this piece? I know you mentioned Cambodia. Were there any other countries which you looked at for this piece?
Yes. Yeah. So we did this research simultaneously in Cambodia and Bangladesh, and as Mina mentioned, COVID hit right after we finished our kickoff event in Cambodia. So we weren't actually able to go ourselves to Bangladesh during this research, but we managed to keep working with the same teams and visit Bangladesh a few times later. Yeah, we worked with local partners on the ground in both places and worked very closely with them remotely while they gathered the, through their networks, managed to connect fairly deeply with a set of survivors in both countries and capture their stories and work with them to share their stories in a way that allowed it to serve as data for us.
Thank you. So you mentioned Bangladesh and Cambodia, and I guess what everyone here is interested to know really is what did you actually find? I mean, I guess when you dig into the paper, you talk about this framework for integration. What are the core tenets of successful integration that you saw through the perspectives of survivors in those countries?
Yeah, Mina, do you want to show the diagram and lead on this part?
Yeah, so from Survive, of course, they gave us lots of testimonies and information. Ultimately, I think what we really achieve is trying to be able to elaborate the complex elements that all kind of weaving together, but also try to be very succinctly mention the 4 key elements, the key pillars. So, for example, I hope you can see my screen. You can see that this is the kind of map that we, in the end, created, and there's bubbles of different elements, and those elements are usually things that you can kind of quantify into like better or worse. So that's the reason why there's little plus and minus signs going on. So to contribute the level of satisfaction or success of their lives, we realize there's 4 major elements based on survivors and what they tell us. So for example, the connection with the birth family, or we realize that some survivors, maybe they are strong mentally, they are okay, but then the moment when they come back, they realize their family is not accepting them, stigma, social norms, or for example, they are living in different places, and that generally becomes quite difficult for them to reintegrate, or maybe they will always feel there's something missing. But for those cases that their family very quickly accepts that and support them in their journey, generally they mention, yeah, I can heal, I can reintegrate back to the society because my parent has been very understanding. They have been very supportive. My wife has been, giving me support. So that connection with family, we realize is very, very permanent in survivors' testimonies. And then also the social respect and acceptance. So more on the society's part. Some cases we learned quite sad and shocking is that some survivor, even after going through the whole process, what actually really destroy them is when they go back to society and because of all the stigmas, they feel like they want to commit suicide, or they have heard other survivors who wanted to have some self-harm. not because of experience of trafficking, but because of how society treat them afterwards. So that society element is also very clear to us. And I guess there was also depends on because we were doing this study in Bangladesh and Cambodia, and both society really it's something that you live in the community. If you're in the village, everybody knows you. Everybody knows that you have went out for 1 or 2 years, aspire to earn some money back to the family, but now you come back, not necessarily that successful. So the society's respect and acceptance also come out very strongly. And there's also mental health. Many survivors describe how they might struggle with stress. Initially, they might need to stay at home a little bit more than usual. Bad dreams, just generally kind of not just the physical part, but the mental health part. It's also very important. Like when they describe, yes, I'm fully healed because now my mental health is better. Or sometimes they will also mention they went out with other survivors, try to share, try to cry together. And the mental health element is also very defining point for their reintegration. And finally, I think also to come out the kind of the strongest element is the financial health. And in here, we emphasize not just personal financial health, but actually their financial health with their family as well. Because what we realize is that in both Cambodia and Bangladesh, you cannot have individual well-being without considering family's well-being. Like if your mom is still sick and your daughter is still like needing school fees to go to the hospital, even if you are all right financially, it's not possible. You have to support your families. So we realize a lot of time that's also something that I guess we reflect on. A lot of the time, at least I think some traditional thinking from the government or from the NGO is like, okay, how can I make this person individual to have a bit more, better financial health? But it's not enough. If your family still have in debt, you might still be migrating again. You might still feel, no, I haven't finished my struggle. And that financial health come out so strongly that it's almost the kind of a one most struggling point for survivors. Like they would not think about, for example, going to court, going to find justice after their and to sue their traffickers because they just don't have the luxury. Immediately once you come back, you are so much in debt, and the only thing you think about is how can I clear my debt? If I can do that, then I can move on and start the next journey. But if I cannot do that, whatever it is, I'm not okay, I'm not all right. I guess also it kind of connects back to the fundamental reason why many of the people who we interview got trafficked in the very beginning, because it was also migration. And the reason why they want to go through migration usually is because that kind of financial struggle. So when they come back, they are usually even worse off in that financial situation. So it's very, very strong and important for them to be able to overcome the point. So yeah, these are the 4 major elements that survivor told us repeatedly again and again in different ways. I will stop here. I don't know, Eric, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, maybe you can just put the diagram back up again. But the main thing here, I guess if you look at this, you might think, okay, so what is there anything surprising or new? And I think what's interesting and new is, I mean, in general, it confirms a lot of other thinking, but in other pieces that we've read and in the way we've seen things generally is that, there'll be a laundry list of issues. So if we ask what is successful reintegration and we're doing programming and we want to support successful reintegration, then there'll be like, a chart or a list of like 20, 30 things that contribute or make up successful reintegration, and we try to address them, but there's no real sense of how they fit together, right? And especially what Mina pointed out is that a lot of times the perspective taken is one of individuals. So we have an individual who is trafficked, we provide them some individual services, and then they'll be better. But in most of the world, individuals exist very deeply within society through these different relationships, So you can't understand why they would do what they do if you don't understand how they fit into society. So both the individuals fit into this social system, which is complex, and the issues themselves, as a result, are all interrelated. So, we could talk about intersectionality and all that, but what we think is that it's great to see it as a system here where the different issues relate to each other, right? So, one thing that came out that might be surprising to people is just that extent to which society's respect and acceptance is so important. There's a lot of talk about stigma, but if you're not deeply embedded in the context, you might think, okay, yes, there's shame and stigma from what happened to you, but just carry on, come do our job skills training or maybe our mental health training, and you'll get over it and it'll be fine and you'll carry on. But we've found that this kind of the despair of thinking that there's nothing I can do to win respect. It doesn't matter if I get a job, or it doesn't matter, I'm staying permanently, and there are differences between women's experiences and men's experiences on that front, which came out more so in Bangladesh than it did in Cambodia, just for cultural reasons. And, whatever country you're working in will be slightly different again. But, if we accept that, stigma and society's acceptance is such a big part of what survivors want and need to feel reintegrated, then what impacts that, right? Is it just getting them a job so that they can say, okay, I failed to earn money abroad, but at least I'm earning now and everything's fine? Is it changing society? Is it working against norms? Is it just getting a bunch of survivors together for a kind of mutual affirmation, so that they can feel comfortable disregarding what society thinks? So we need to think about how each of the issues fits deeper within society, and how the point of having a systemic picture like this is to point us to areas where interventions would make sense. Because if the system functions in this way, it's going to keep on functioning in this way. And if we want to change it, we really need to change those functions, right? Those connections between things that end up harming.
Yeah, maybe I will just add very quickly. So if you can see the map, you will realize there's actually more points. So for example, even on the mental health part, it's not just the trafficking experience itself, but also the experience in prison and detention, because many survivors, before they actually come back home, they would interactions with that migratory kind of immigration system. Or for example, when it comes to financial health, it's not just like the journey costs money for them to go away, for example, from Bangladesh to Middle East, but also there were some quite bad, like a predatory type of lending options that really increase the debt quite dramatically. So I guess if you don't have time necessarily to read the entire report, I still very much encourage you to go through it, because we insert lots of quotes from survivors, and I think they are really illustrative and can really showcase what have they been through in their lives. Also, for example, we also mentioned some of the other things that say lack of control in one's life, because many survivors mention the difficulties in literacy, numeracy, and ultimately also kind of contribute to issues around financial health, mental health. So as Eric mentioned, a lot of the study what we saw is a whole huge laundry list, which you can also more or less see like we did include that, but then in a sense we try to also summarize them in something that's more defining points for survivors in reintegration. Okay, thank you. Back to you, Jean-Luc.
No, thank you both. And I just pasted a link to the map that both Mina and Eric are talking about, and it's quite interesting, because if you actually click on the different bubbles, you actually get quotes. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Mina and Eric, actual quotes from the research, things that people said, both in Cambodia and Bangladesh.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, I mean, and you set me up for my next question perfectly, right? I mean, as Eric said, I think it's quite intuitive that, these things are important for well-being, not just for survivors, for human beings in general, right? Acceptance in society, you know, mental health, financial health, etc., etc. And you know, bringing all this together, you know, in the systems thinking about how survivors have to navigate, you know, the social context they live in, perhaps the socio-political situations, the relational dimensions, all these things is important for CTIP. I think the question I want to ask is, what does this mean for practitioners? What do these findings mean for practitioners? How can CTIP programs take this and use it in a way that can lead to more equitable outcomes for survivors?
Yeah, thank you. So one point to start off with is in our experience, and especially in, you know, now that we've been doing this for about 5 years since we started this first report, you know, we've seen practitioners, those on the ground in countries like Cambodia and Bangladesh, generally have a great deal of knowledge, right? They know what they're doing, and they have very sophisticated understanding of these deep interconnected issues. That's rarely, if ever, reflected in the literature, right? And so those of us who aren't locally embedded practitioners, if we're at NGOs or running donor-funded projects, or, you know, even elites within our own developing countries where these issues are being addressed, we don't tend to know those things, right? So there's a challenge that those of us who control the money and power about running programs don't tend to know what people on the ground know. And the research, the evidence we draw on doesn't tend to reflect that complexity of the lived experience. Meanwhile, you know, the people on the ground, the amazing, you know, everyday heroes who are working on counter trafficking, have a deep experiential knowledge, either of having been trafficked themselves or working with so many trafficking survivors and hitting their head against the wall of trying to figure out what to do over and over. But they don't have the resource of having that grounded in, you know, peer-reviewed literature or rigorous studies to affirm, validate what they're saying, what they know. It's just, you know, we talk to tons and tons of local practitioners. They all seem to know, but they don't know that the others know. They don't know that this should be, you know, their common sense is something that should be reflected in the higher level kind of knowledge banks. So I think, you know, that's one key point. And practitioners, you know, we need to start seeing, and I think it's becoming a trend, that systemic nature of problems. You know, the term wicked problems has been around for a long time. You know, problems that resist easy solutions, and trafficking is a key one, where if you talk to almost anybody in the world, they'll agree that trafficking shouldn't happen. Even a lot of traffickers themselves will say, yeah, this shouldn't be possible. We shouldn't have to do this. We do it, we choose to do it, but we don't want to be doing this, right? So what do we do, right? The only way is to understand those deeper systems that keep on recreating the problem. And seeing it that way, this kind of model thinking where, you know, even if you work in a different country than ours, your map might look different from our map, but starting to think, building that mental model of a system map of what's going on here. What is it that keeps driving the problem, and how can we change it? I think that's the answer. And in our experience, it tends to be very relational and very informal. So going back to that, valuing the people on the ground who know, who feel it, who live that experience, and realize, like, they may not know they have the answer, but they probably have the right hypothesis that we should be testing, right? And we've seen that in future projects where people did things in a very relational way, like between a women's shelter and the police, you know, it's finding the right person in the police to talk to. And suddenly you start building a new dynamic, and suddenly, at least in your local area, the system functions differently. So I think that's the key, we would say, to practitioners. Value people on the ground, their lived experience, find a way to build that mental map of how systems actually work and realize that change happens through the very informal and relational processes.
Yeah, I will share a few more points. So, for example, we can see a lot of NGOs or governments are providing support to survivors through, for example, job trainings or job matching, teaching you how to fix motorbike, or how to do sewing and stuff, which is great, which is helpful. But one thing we realized that might be also quite important is, for example, life skill trainings, and we saw that in, for example, the survivor groups in Bangladesh, they mentioned so much how life skill training transformed their lives. And here we're talking about life skills, not necessarily second job skills. So life skills include, for example, literacy, numeracy, and being able to spot signs, being able to kind of just how you carry yourself in the society in general. Or for example,
And this is, sorry, just to point out, this is sort of a case in point that proves or demonstrates what I was trying to say. Because if you think about it, what is life skills training? How is it different from anything else? Like, we've seen the curriculum, we've seen how it works, and on the face of it, I couldn't tell you how to reproduce that. I couldn't just say, oh, instead of doing job skills training, do life skills training and use this curriculum. No, what really made that different and unique is that it was jointly produced between the NGO workers, I believe your Winrock colleagues, and survivors themselves, right? Where they, using their own mental map and intuition about the links between different things, found a balance that really worked for them between like helping us heal our mental health, or, you know, overcome stigma or deal with trauma or think about our feelings, plus job, you know, what skills you need. Like Mina said, is it just job skills? Is it skills about doing other random things? And nobody could prescribe that ahead of time, right? It has to be designed within that systemic context. And it seems to have worked incredibly well, but in a way that, beyond what I just said, we can't advise you how to do that, right? There's no curriculum that's universal. Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing I think, for example, what we emphasize about the family as a unit, not individual. So what can be quite effective, and we have seen some cases, is that before survivor going back to their village and meeting their family, some of the really powerful NGOs, very effective NGOs, they will be try to communicate with the family first to prepare them mentally to let them know it's not your daughter's fault that she was trafficked to Malaysia. It's not your daughter's fault that she met a bad employer that ended up abusing her, for example, and then really try to help the family to understand, and be able to have a better attitude and receiving their family members. So that kind of work that really not emphasizing just individuals, but the whole family. It's also what we see as quite a good concept, practice that really utilizing what we are seeing important, the concept behind. The other one also similarly. So for example, in Bangladesh, the last few years, there has been a campaign around like ending child marriage, telling people that child marriage is not great, even though it has been in society for many years. But it's kind of like an effort to change society's perspective on certain type of issues. And we would very much love to see around the same line about, for example, not to shame, not to stigmatizing survivors, because you can see quite a lot of awareness raising, but usually awareness raising is more around how to prevent people who got trafficked, to put signs on the airport and saying, oh yeah, be aware of this and that opportunities. But you really actually see efforts in trying to balance that shame. And in a sense, the more you tell people, oh yeah, be careful about problematic brokers, they may traffic you. It might have like an unexpected effect that the other people say, oh, didn't you see those signs? Didn't you know those? Yeah, how naive or how this and that of you, like you still get exploited. So if you don't be careful, that balance may be a little bit dangerous. So what we would say it's also just a similar concept like how we work on families. When we are doing prevention work, there might be worth to include some elements around reintegration, not just on the prevention element. Recently, I've also heard some prosecutors who, in the process of trying to prosecute the traffickers, really prioritizing survivors' needs. And I heard some really incredible sentence from them that they realize, okay, if the survivors really don't want to pursue prosecution, that's fine, and they will try to prioritize that well-being, that need, because it is quite time-consuming. It is very much damaging if you ask somebody from the village traveling to the city all the time to provide testimonies, to send on the court, to spend their own money. I think that's also another element that really need us to keep reminding ourselves that, of course, from the kind of a state perspective, or from the more kind of a law enforcement perspective, you want survivors to come out because you want to pursue the traffickers, but on what cost? And it actually could be survivors' reintegration cost. Like they don't necessarily pursuing traffickers as their top priority. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a whole spectrum. You can definitely find people who are also very, very keen in stopping their traffickers, but equally, some people, they are just so worried about their current well-being, some of their financial health. So that respect and that understanding around that, maybe certain things that the state worry most is not aligning with survivors' value system. I think that's a good point to keep in mind.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Mina. And Eric, did you want to add something just briefly or no?
No.
Okay, no, brilliant. No, thanks for that. No, I think what I'm hearing is that, I mean, as Eric mentioned, I think, we can talk a lot about, systems, etc., all the complexities, of the realities that survivors to go through and navigate. But ultimately, it's about listening. I think as for practitioners, a guide for practitioners would be just simply to listen, to work with survivors, to better understand what they need and what they go through. Mina, you mentioned, I think, also a bit around the messaging, to be less maybe paternalistic around the awareness building stuff. People know that they shouldn't go somewhere, or they shouldn't,
Yeah,
do
I think
certain
it's
things, right?
balancing it. We can kind of do awareness and prevention work, but equally, that should be careful in the messaging of reintegration in supporting survivors as well, like not making the prevention work become another potential weapon for nanny and stigma. So it's about finding that balance. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think on that note, I have a few questions left, but because of time, I think I want to just ask the one important one, because I think it links all this together, and not just for this paper, but I think, the spirit of the last three papers as well. So it's been a lot around the perspectives of survivors. Hence, obviously, it means working with survivors, spending time, etc. Is there any practical advice you have for whether it be organizations, researchers, practitioners who are keen to work, to do similar work, to understand, what survivors need? That's the first sort of mini question. Second one is, do you have any future planned work around this topic?
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Mina.
So we reflect on how much, the work. The reason why we are able to get good data, and by the way, not maybe only just for this report, but for the reports that afterwards, one thing that we value a lot, not just for the research itself, but also the kind of connections and genuine friendship and relationship we build with survivors afterwards. And we can also see there is a bit of a progression. I mean, this report that we're talking about here is actually the first of a series, but for example, towards the end, I think we got even closer and closer with survivors who, for example, the survivor groups, and that's something that we really value a lot, and we realize that the relationship it's beyond a simple interview of like 1 hour or 2 hours, but we are more integrated into their lives. Like they may come up to us and asking, hey, how do I build a website? Hey, like should I apply this award? It's almost going on a little bit more, and we value that very much. We think that's something actually coming back to what Eric was mentioning, the relational part. So I guess what we would always say, maybe one of the most powerful way, is to have that kind of participatory action research element. So in a sense, you almost situate in between programming and research. Like it's not purely research that you just come in and dig and go out. It's also not necessarily fully programming that you don't necessarily track that much about the learning. Maybe you track the impact, but you don't necessarily track the learning. But we are kind of trying to situate in between. Like it has the element of research, but also programming. And I mean, again, of course, recognizing not necessarily everyone intends to do that or have luxury of time and space to do that. But if it's possible, we would say that's maybe one of the most impactful way, because you will get some good data and research outcomes in the end, but also at the same time, you don't just again exploit people who become your data, but you actually be able to have a bit more going on with that, and they become your Facebook friends, they become your WhatsApp connections. So that's something that we would say can be quite great. And around the future research part, I mean, because we have worked with survivor groups and we see how powerful it is. When we say survivor groups, it's not just NGOs working with survivors, it's survivors coming together. They have their own leadership, they do elections, they are able to make their own programmings, and they sometimes even are able to identify who are the traffickers in this community, or knowing like, okay, next village, somebody is going to take the flight tomorrow. We need to go and check if their passport is genuine, making sure they don't get trafficked, that kind of a survivor group. And we realize it's really powerful. So we would love to kind of replicate the similar models in other countries. We talk about in Asia or even in Africa, a lot of countries at the moment don't have the kind of survivor group system. And if we have the opportunity to have the next research, we would also love to do a bit more like action research, in a sense like trying to set up this type of survivor groups, and also to study and to learn how effective and how some learning can generate from that process. Eric, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just what we've learned about what I said already about how things change through informal and relational means. At some point, the key problem with all the wicked problems, right, is there's these bigger systems where people don't have enough power to prevent themselves from being exploited, right? So at some point, power is central to everything. And in traditional programming, maybe we don't think too much about the issue of power. It's a sort of technocratic, professional situation. We have money, we have resources, we have a mandate, we do our job, we get the resources over there, we help people, right? And that can be fine, if not ideal. But when you want to do the kind of stuff that we've attempted, where you try to build the relationships with people, you have to be really careful, because you become the front line of that power differential, right? As an outside actor, you tend to have more power, especially if you have money. So, we would suggest, if you can read our report and others like this, there's a huge literature on participatory action research, where you can start to think through positionality, the role you play as researcher / change agent, and really think through the power dynamics and stuff. We don't suggest everyone do this in a naive way, because you'll just be part of another kind of problem. But yeah, if you're genuinely interested in creating change through relational means, then let the relationships be your barometer. If you don't have strong relationships, you probably shouldn't be working on that issue right now. Try to make the connections, and be led by the people who have who are most impacted, and therefore most centrally placed to work on the issues. Be led by them, and if you find an opportunity with them, then be mindful of your own power in those interactions. And I think that's how we can try to make genuine change.
Thank you both for your really valuable insights today. And to all our participants, please feel free to put any questions you have into the chat. I don't see any at the moment from Mina and Eric. Feel free also, if you prefer, just to use the raise hand function, unmute yourself.
It seems like we don't, but you know, maybe people can message us if they have any further questions. You can direct message us here in the call, and we can direct you to resources or answer any questions.
Absolutely. I think, if you don't have any questions right this moment, or if you're thinking about, I understand it's quite a lot to think about, sort of mule over, feel free to reach out to us. We'll be sharing contact at the end of this presentation as well. So you'll have the contact of HRC, Mina, Eric, and feel free to reach out to the team. Great team. Some excellent research. I think there's a question from Marie, maybe. To Mina specifically. Marie's interested to know where, I guess, where this research specifically was conducted in Bangladesh, which parts of Bangladesh, which areas. I think that's what Marie's asking.
Yeah. Eric, do you remember that? It was a long
I believe we
ago.
we worked in 4 different areas. I think we tried to get a representation of each of the 4 main parts of Bangladesh. I'd have to reconsult the report to remember exactly where we worked, but yeah, I mean, we used through the networks, basically the Anirban network. So areas where Anirban was working. So yeah, there's no way to say it was representative of all of Bangladesh, but we tried to get a diversity of areas.
Yeah, I think there was an Aniban network. They have like in Jashore and Cox's Bazar and 2 other places I forgot now. But I think also because that one, as we described initially, want to use more participatory method, but because COVID hits, so in the end we actually have to depend more on our local researchers to support some of the data collection. Yeah, I mean we can try to maybe come back with the information. But thank you so much, Mary, for asking that.
Thank you so much. Sophie has a message, not so much a question, but message of thanks. I think we all feel the same way. I think it's again, as I mentioned, quite a pioneering piece of work 4 years ago, and maybe I do have, if no one else has a question, maybe I could just step forward now and put a question out, because this is quite relatively dated research, right? It's conducted 4 years ago. Has there been anything which you've worked on, research projects worked on since then, which has maybe changed your thinking on the analysis, the framework that you showed us today?
Yeah, I think, for example, okay, the first one was reintegration, then afterwards we have victim identification, then the kind of assistance vulnerability. And I think when it comes to victim identification, of course, it also connects back to reintegration. And it was just quite interesting to see how the term victim identification is not even properly defined. Like some people think victim identification as the moment when we find out, oh, the victim is located in that building, or some literature is more kind of a, referring as a formal process when the government bring a person to court and be able to identify, yes, this is a victim. So I mean, you just realize that there's a little bit of vagueness in the literature. And also I think for that report we try to emphasize not just on the responsibility of one side, because for example, if you look at more like a police criminal type of literature, they emphasize how the authorities need to try harder to be able to identify the survivors. But also sometimes you realize other literature is emphasizing a lot on survivors' role in trying to present themselves to the authority, and sometimes putting more blame on this side. But we try to come up with more like mirroring type of ideas and emphasizing the both of them and how they should be able to come closer to each other. So I think that was also, by the way, all the research, of course, is very, very helpful for us to reflect that thinking. And I guess like coming fast forward to the systemic vulnerability, that's also a very good process because I guess traditionally when we see a crime that it's always very easy to finger pointing to say, okay, this is the problem, this is a criminal. And if we remove that criminal, things will be all right. But the problem is, as we described, it's all a systemic issue. I guess in a sense, it's very much sociology, like why certain area have more crime, certain area has more issues. So in the end, like when we think about systemic vulnerability, we don't try to just finger pointing on individual like traffickers, nor to point out, okay, this person is vulnerable because he or she lack of education or like is poor and therefore more vulnerable to be trafficked. We try to emphasize and capture the larger backgrounds, why certain why vulnerability is being like generated and accumulated in society. That could be down to how society functions, how certain area of the policy functions, and therefore you will have more people who are being considered as vulnerable. And similarly, when it comes to trafficker, I mean, okay, we try to. There's one thing like I like to use analogy. When we overemphasize about the vulnerability of somebody, it's a bit like in the case of a sexual harassment, you emphasize, oh yeah, but what did she wear? Why did she appear, like in the middle of the night? Things like that. So there's a little bit of a danger, like if you overemphasize, yeah, why certain people are more vulnerable. But the bigger question is, even if the person today is, really right, naked, or let's say, okay, super poor, super, vulnerable, there still should not be exploitation happening if the traffickers are removed, if the society is functioning healthy enough. So we try to emphasize that bigger picture, and I think that was a very good journey, and there was lots of debate between all of us together, Jean-Luc and at the time also Michelle. We tried to contribute different elements and like why so it was less and less of the thinking, and it was a really great process. Eric, do you want to add something?
Yeah, it's gone. Hold on. John, remind me of what you actually asked.
So sorry, the question was about whether there are any, because it's been 4 years, right, since the piece was published.
Yes.
Any updates, edits you'd make, based on what you've learned since then.
Yeah. I mean, so like Mina said, we really built on each successive piece of work. So I think definitely we've learned more deeply about some of these things. Like she was saying, in the latest project, we were able to spend, 6 weeks organizing with a set of survivors in Joshua. And that was a direct effort both to learn but also to create change, right? Because after 3 years at that time identifying places to intervene, then we were able to, through those same relationships, try to change things, right, with them and be led by them and support them. So I think in doing that, we've learned a lot. Like in that case, we weren't talking about reintegration fully, but we were talking about empowerment and, quality of life things for people going forward. So it basically was the same. It's an element of reintegration. So I don't think we've uncovered anything that's like, oh, we were really wrong about it at that time. But definitely we've learned more. Yeah. And I mean, I think, I wanted to point people to, there's an organization called GFEMS, Global Fund for Ending Modern Slavery. And around the same, as we've been working, they've been following a similar journey, and they've put out 2 really cool guidelines or guidebooks for working with survivors, people with lived experience, as they call it. One in research context and one in sort of advocacy change-making context. So they've articulated it as well as anybody can, I think, and they're also really cool. So I point you to them.
Thanks, Eric. And I think that's very apt, especially, I mean, I love Salam's comment, and I think the GFEM's guidance, I think epitomizes everything that Salam said. And so please, we can send you those links as well. But if you're interested, please do check out GFEM's in the website. Take a look at their guidance on engaging survivors. Okay, so thank you so much, Mina and Eric, once again. We'll move on to the next segment because we do have lots more to talk about. And we're moving to a different but related topic. We are still talking about reintegration, part of today's theme, but we're moving more specifically into sport as a tool for reintegration, which some of you might find maybe quite curious, right? So before we speak about this, I wanted just to preface this part of the webinar. Many of us have a positive relationship with sports, physical activity. You've probably exercised already today, or you maybe plan to do so later on. And most of us are quite fortunate to experience the benefits of regular exercise, physical activity, movement. And it may seem pretty obvious or intuitive to say that sports can be beneficial also for trauma victims, including survivors of trafficking. However, our team, my colleague Jonathan is here today, who worked very hard on the SLR. Our team was keen to understand whether there was an empirical foundation for this belief. We wanted to understand the specific outcomes that sport could achieve and the underlying mechanisms at play. And in fact, as I said, there is a link to Eric and Mina's work. The framework that we looked at, the outcomes that we looked at specifically, were exactly what Eric and Mina mentioned, what they developed. We looked at outcomes across psychosocial effects, social effects, financial health, and also, I believe, community acceptance. But I don't want to spoil it too much for Jonathan, because he'll take you through our findings and talk you through more of the SL just in a second. Just quickly, briefly, Jonathan is the monitoring, evaluation, and learning consultant for our project. He does about 15 other jobs as well, and he can probably speak for himself, so I'll leave him to it. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Jean-Luc. Hi, everyone. Here, let me just share the slides real fast. As Jean-Luc said, I'm a consultant with the Asia CTIP team. I'm actually based out of Berkeley, and I also am a researcher at UC Berkeley for a research group on campus that does global poverty evaluation research broadly. And I'm really excited to talk about this SLR, and I'll get to it. Oh, can you, let's see, actually click the link. Okay. Can you all see this? Okay. Okay, great. Okay, so Jean-Luc gave a really great motivation for explaining why we're doing this. And I just want to add that, so annually, there are over $200 million spent on sports for development programs globally. It's also known as SFD. And there are a lot of development and counter-trafficking organizations that have sports programs or are interested in implementing these programs. But we wanted to learn a little bit more about what the research says so that we're able to follow best practices. And some of the questions we had when we started off doing this research was, one, does SFD actually even work for survivors of trafficking? And specifically, can it lead to better reintegration outcomes, such as the psychosocial, psychological, the social reintegration, and livelihoods outcomes that Eric and Mina were talking about earlier? Are certain sports more effective or more appropriate for the trafficking context? And if you have a program, should there be complementary programming in addition to the sports component, and then practically what are some implementation challenges or risks for programs. And so we, as we started to look at this, we realized that really there was only one paper that we could find that directly studies SFD for survivors of trafficking. And we're lucky that we get to hear from the authors later. But in order to expand our scope, we started looking at other populations that we thought might be similar to trafficking as close as we could. And we defined this based on people that have experienced similar types of traumas that can occur during trafficking. So we identified three main groups: survivors of gender-based intimate partner violence and sexual violence, and then war and conflict survivors, and then survivors of forced displacement and refugee trauma. And then for SLR, we followed the following methodology. So we first searched several databases for papers published within the last 10 years, and that returned about 7,000 studies. We screened those titles and abstracts to narrow it down to about 100 studies. We then read through those papers, and then we found 7 studies that fit our eligibility criteria. So, and the criteria again are, so we wanted the target population we defined earlier of people that had similar experiences to trafficking survivors. And then we also want to make sure the paper actually evaluated and implemented SFD programs. So not just a one-day event or people who just happen to play football, for example. And so we found a very diverse set of 8 studies. So we have a range of the types of traumas that people experience. These people also experience trauma symptoms such as depression, PTSD, anxiety, as well as chronic pain. The types of sports that were covered in these studies were also quite diverse. So we had 3 yoga papers, 3 papers that looked at football and group sports. We had a snow sports paper, and then fly fishing. So we took a very loose definition of sport, but we wanted to be inclusive. And the locations were also quite diverse. So half of them were in the US, 2 were in Africa, and 2 were in Europe. We had representation across gender, a very wide range of ages from teenagers basically to 60-year-olds. And there was quite a bit of methodological diversity as well. So pre-post studies, so a baseline and end line for one main group, 2 papers that were experimental, and then papers that did focus groups or structured interviews or case studies. And so clearly you can see that there are limitations around, well, one, we just had 8 studies. The types of methodologies, really, we only had one paper where we could do causal inference because there was just one RCT. And then the generalization, like the ability for you to generalize across geographies and ages and genders is something that one needs to think about when trying to learn from these papers. But with those caveats in mind, yeah, I'll give a high-level overview of the outcomes we're interested in. Overall, we saw very strong positive psychological and psychosocial effects from sport for development programs. So in the RCT, they actually found both a statistically significant decrease in PTSD and depression in the yoga group compared to the control group, and the effect size was also quite large, and the authors placed it in the same magnitude as medication. And then anecdotally, there were also lots of reports of improved mood, distraction from trauma, optimism about the future, and then quotes and stories about people feeling more self-compassion and feeling more connected between their body and their mind following trauma. And then we also saw moderate social reintegration effects. So a lot of anecdotal evidence talking about improved relationships with people, family, marital relationships, an increased perception of social and emotional support from the people around them, and then also deep connections between the people that they participated in the program with. For livelihoods, we did not find any evidence for or against it was just not in scope for these papers. These papers also helped us understand a lot about the mechanisms and the theory behind why sport for development is working. So a lot of the papers emphasize that the physical aspect of the sport itself was quite important. So particularly interoception, that is, so the connection between the brain and the body. And so again, in the RCT, they found that with the yoga component, the PTSD symptoms actually, the benefits with PTSD persisted much longer than with a traditional peer support group. And so, yeah, there must be some like additive effect that the sport itself is having. And Nami et al. Also talk about, yeah, healing through bodily self-awareness and interoception and increasing individual agency. They can talk more about that later. And then there are also a lot of other sort of frameworks that were given. One in particular, I'll talk about Lei et al.'s 2018 framework, but they give three basically explanations for why sport might be working. So the first one is what they call the motivational restorative effect, basically feeling happier and just enjoying life more. Then a distraction effect. So while one is focused on sport and in like a flow state, they're free from sort of intrusive thoughts and they're just more present. And then the last is an exposure effect. So sport helps build resilience and coping ability for small challenges that come up. And so in conclusion, based on our SLR, yeah, there are clearly a lot more research opportunities in this particular intersection between trafficking and SFD. But from what we see, it does seem very promising for trafficking survivors. And there were a few practical implementation lessons that we saw from these papers. So one, the type of sport seems actually quite important. So it should really match the goals of the program and the needs of the participants. And for example, yoga seems particularly good for survivors of sexual trauma because of the need to repair that body-mind connection. And then maybe if you care a lot about teamwork or social bonding, you might want to pick like a team sport. So something like a football program. And then complementary programming is also quite important. All the papers that we read had some type of auxiliary program. So talk therapy, health education, financial literacy, training, all these things seem to complement the sport aspect. And then creating the right environment also seemed very important. So a lot of papers emphasize the importance of being in nature or having a space that felt really safe and comfortable for people. And that relates to the next point. So SFD programs are not without risk. And one of the biggest risks is re-traumatization that can happen when through like the strain or pain sensations that can occur in sport. And so it's important to have some trained personnel and then also follow trauma-sensitive programming guidelines to make sure that yeah, you can avoid or treat people that have been re-traumatized. Yeah, so that is yeah, our paper. Hope yeah, if you have more questions, feel free to read the full study. And I hope it was useful for your program.
Thank you, Jonathan, for taking us through those findings from our SLR. Quite in-depth findings in record time as well. So thank you for that. As Jonathan said, I think if you do have questions, we can take them at the end of the next presentation. But also, I think you'll find a lot of the answers in the SLR itself. It's quite a accessibly written document. We've done it in that way to make sure that people do read it, so it's not high level at all. So yeah, please, I urge you to read it, and yeah, ask us if you have any questions also by our email, which I'll share at the end of this presentation. Right, so as Jonathan mentioned, 8 studies were included in this systematic literature review, and we looked at over 7,000 papers. But only one directly explored the effects of sports programming or sports for development on survivors of trafficking. This was a pre-post test, as Jonathan mentioned, led by a team of researchers from the University of Alabama, in collaboration with an organization called Healing and Resilience After Trauma, better known through their acronym HART or HEART. The HEART Project is a feminist organization focusing on supporting women and girls affected by gender-based violence. Their main program, Move with HEART, provides a compassionate space for survivors to experience collective healing and well-being. HEART also provides support for gender-based violence activists, staff, and researchers. I'm really glad to be able to have on the webinar today the co-director of HEART, Sophie Nami, who is a feminist activist and researcher with over 15 years of experience working to prevent violence against women. Alongside her, I'm delighted to also have HEART's Uganda country director, Sylvia Namakula. Sylvia has been working in this space for over 2 decades across HEART's research, programming, and partner engagement work streams. Sophie and Sylvia, thank you so much for being here today to share your experience, and we look forward to a great presentation.
Thank you, John.
Thanks so much, John-Luc. And just also really want to appreciate the previous speakers, Mina, Eric, and John, for all the interesting points raised already in this conversation. We're so happy to join. And to all of you who are listening, we've been talking for a little while, so please feel free to get up and move around and make sure that you're comfortable. And thanks for staying with us into the second hour. Yeah, so I think, Kwan, can you go to the next slide, please? Just to give a brief overview, Sylvia and I are really excited to be here, and we're gonna share this presentation. So I will start by actually talking a little bit more bigger picture on what is trauma, and kind of deepening some of the mechanisms that Jonathan has already shared with us on how sports-based programming and movement can really underlie healing for trauma survivors. And then I'll just give a bit more details around the Move with Heart program before passing over to Sylvia, who will talk us through some of the research and learning, including the pilot study that was part of the SLR that we just heard about, as well as more recent research, which isn't yet published, but we're really excited about. And then I think we're going to have a question and answer period, though please feel free to use the chat as we go, or we can have this be a bit more interactive if anyone has questions as we're going through the slides. Next slide, please. So yeah, I think it's important to define trauma, at least in the context of this conversation, because we all have, this is clearly something most of us have probably experienced, We're all working to support survivors of human trafficking who have their own lived experiences of trauma, and just to bring us to the same page as to when we use this language of trauma, what is it that we really have in mind? Next slide, please. And I love this definition because it's non-clinical, and I think it's very relatable. So we can really define trauma as anything that overwhelms us and undermines our ability to cope, leaving us feeling helpless, hopeless, and out of control. And you can feel free to add other definitions that you like and like to use in the chat. For us at Heart, I think the key point is that the trauma isn't the event that happens. The trauma is really what happens within us in terms of our response to that event. So it's about how we integrate and recover from something that we experience as traumatic. And I think this is helpful because it also helps underline that two people won't experience the same event in the same way. And so something that might be really traumatizing to me might not feel that way to Sylvia, and vice versa. And even over the course of our own lives, you know, our ability to tolerate potentially difficult events changes. And I think when we start to work with survivors, keeping that awareness in mind also helps us avoid kind of casting everyone in the same lens and treating people as victims instead of really respecting their agency and their own resilience, which I think also came out nicely in some of the comments in the chat earlier. Okay, so we can go to the next slide, please. And we're also learning more and more about how trauma impacts the body. I think that Bessel van der Kolk, he's the lead author in that randomized controlled trial study that Jonathan just shared about in the SLR. He, with this book, really helped shine a big light on this, because the title itself, I think, is quite curious and quite insightful. The body keeps the score. And in the book, he talks about how trauma is not the story of something that happened back then, but it's the current imprint of that pain, horror, and fear living inside people. So understanding this is really key to understanding why movement and sports holds such potential for healing and recovery. Next slide, please. And if we just go one layer deeper into this, you know, if you take a moment and look at this image and imagine what it feels like to be this gazelle, or this like young deer, I think it's a gazelle, running for its life. And really just take a minute, you know, and imagine yourself in this situation. Like, this is a life-threatening, very life-threatening situation, and how that feels inside your own body. Because I know that all of us on this call have had experiences, you know, hopefully not this severe, but we've certainly had experiences where we felt that onset of fear and that response in our own nervous system, where we're really activated for survival. And interestingly enough, this can be a kind of real experience like this, where you're being chased down, but it can also be an experience that you're living or reliving in your mind, because our brain can't always distinguish between those two things. So just as an easy example, maybe you're watching, you know, a scary movie, and all of a sudden you feel that same fear response inside you, even though you're sitting, you know, quite safe in your own home on your sofa. And what's happening within this kind of situation where we have this fight, flight, or freeze response is that all of our survival systems are activated and kicking into gear. And these are quite primitive responses in the sense of like the areas of the brain that are being activated. So this young gazelle right about now probably has a lot of cortisol in her body and her bloodstream. Her heart rate is very elevated. Blood is being diverted from non-essential muscle groups into those big muscles that are helping her to run and get away. And anything that's non-essential will be shut down. So her digestive system won't be working very well, reproductive system, because those aren't necessary in this moment. And you know, the body is immensely intelligent in terms of how it acts in these kinds of situations. And this state in itself is not a harmful state, but the important thing is that they're designed to be short-term and short-lived. So once the danger passes, so let's imagine this gazelle gets away, she will, be able to shake it off and like really come back into a balanced state of being and like recover a state of calm. Sometimes we don't come back into balance and we become stuck in these like more out of balance or, a state of sympathetic arousal, like so hyper-aroused nervous system, your fight or flight response. And if you imagine staying in that state for a long time, I think it becomes really clear how that trauma living within you starts to cause like a range of very difficult symptoms and affects your well-being and your ability to make healthy connections with family and friends and loved ones. And if we can just go to the next slide, please. I'm just gonna read this quote and try to make it a bit bigger on my screen so I can see it, which I think really also encapsulates or illustrates really well what would happen if we were in that state for a long period of time. So the body system, alarm systems turn on. We experience the intense suffering of not truly feeling relaxed for an easy time and always being on guard. The primitive brain will be scanning for threats or opportunities. Our inner sensory is always on watch. We cannot sleep. Our trust in the rightness of things is temporarily destroyed. For those of us who have been traumatized, the body can become a kind of alien force, and we perceive it as unknown, unpredictable, and unreliable. So in that, in this kind of state of really being disconnected from the body, there's many trauma-related symptoms can set in, like from muscular pain and tightness to more chronic states of stress or anxiety, not being able to sleep, which then again has like a cascading impact or ripple effect on many other negative mental health and physical health symptoms. We might feel always afraid or just in general be unable to experience positive emotions. Next slide, please. And here's like kind of where we pivot and change the story a bit, because much as we can have that traumatic experience living inside of us, we also have the same capacity for healing. And I think more and more we're learning about how the body can, in van der Kolk's language, keep the score of trauma, but also offer the potential through that trauma and that potential for healing. And so the way I like to think of it is, although we can't change the past, we can really change how the past lives within us in this moment. And I think both from just our experiences at heart and kind of a growing body of evidence in the literature, we're seeing more and more how movement and sports and breathing practices can help kind of activate that healing potential within us. Next slide, please. And I think Jonathan presented the mechanisms already, so I'll just kind of echo the point already made that mind-body practices. So I guess we're kind of a subset of other sports-based programming if you think about the diversity of physical activity and exercises that we might consider. But there is an increasing body of literature around the psychological benefits, the neurobiological benefits or the changes in the brain, and also the social benefits. And while, I think the finding from the SLR that this has not been applied, or this insight hasn't really picked up within the anti-trafficking space, is really interesting, because actually within other communities and other populations, there is a lot more available literature around the positive potential of movement and sports for healing. So it's really highlighting, I think, a gap in our own, in the areas where we're all working, that is just interesting to reflect on. Next slide, please. So I thought for those of you who this is potentially still sounding a bit abstract, walk you through a few of the symptoms and how the movement practice, and particularly a movement practice that's facilitated through trauma-informed facilitation in a safe space, can really help to offset some of these symptoms. So for example, we saw, like, if you're that, again, thinking about that young gazelle, you're gonna be really fearful in those moments. And if you don't get out of that state, you will continue to be on high alert. And then through the movement, there's actual empirical studies that show how the body can start to release stress-reducing neurotransmitters and increase parasympathetic activation. The parasympathetic branch of our nervous system is kind of the rest and digest system that helps to counter that fight or flight mode that we're in when we're in a traumatic situation or a potentially dangerous situation. And so this is something that's happening at the kind of level of our physiology. And then feelings of being helpless or powerless, or movement and sports can help us connect with our physical strength. And also when we're learning new movements or new practices, we start to feel powerful inside, right? Something you couldn't do yesterday, you can now do today. And that triggers, that can build self-esteem and self-confidence. And then also this feeling of being lonely and isolated, and through this bonded experience of a group-based movement practice, we start to buffer that feeling of isolation and feel more connected and in community. We also know that trauma and other mental health symptoms can lead to difficulties eating or sleeping. And then with the movement itself, we're actually creating rhythms, and we're creating internal rhythms of moving our body as we breathe. And we're also hopefully creating rhythms with other people that we're moving together with. And that can actually help reset some of our biorhythms. And then this feeling of being disconnected from our body and having poor interoception. Interoception is the ability to kind of feel into what sensations you might be having at a given moment. With the trauma-informed facilitation, we're often given cues or invitations to notice what's going on inside. And that constant, like, turning inward can help us build our interoceptive awareness. And then in terms of muscular tension and physical pain that might be linked to mental stress through movement and sports and yoga, we start to build flexibility, we start to strengthen our muscles and just create more openness in the body. Next slide, please. So yeah, so this is really the kind of motivation and theoretical foundation for our work at Healing and Resilience After Trauma. And really, we started with a pretty, simple, I think John-Luc, you said it at the beginning, it's pretty obvious, right? We've all had our own experiences. Well, maybe perhaps not all of us, but many of us have had our own experiences of healing through movement or breath or introspection or different contemplative practices, including sports. And so taking that kind of lived experience and then seeing resonance in the literature, and then recognizing the gap in terms of supporting survivors of gender-based violence and survivors of human trafficking. We wanted to be able to bring this container, the safe container where collective movement and healing can happen to women and girls who we knew or we imagined could really benefit from such spaces. Next slide, please. And I think I've already talked a bit about our story. Well, we started in 2016 in Uganda with this motivation that I just shared of bringing these feminist spaces and mind-body practices to survivors. And the program itself, so it's a little bit confusing. Our name as an organization is Healing and Resilience After Trauma, so we go by HEART, and our program is called Move with HEART. And right now, well, since 2016, we've been facilitating Move with HEART sessions with survivors in Uganda, and then more recently, since 2021, we adapted our program with a partner, the Alazan Foundation in the Philippines, and they've been running groups since then in Cebu. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just want to walk you through a few aspects of our theory of change. I'm not going to go through this in a lot of depth, but essentially what we're saying is that our approach, and again, like we're a mind-body approach, but we're also intentionally grounded in feminist and trauma-informed principles, leads to various pathways towards healing, which has short-term outcomes and longer-term impacts. I think I just want to touch on a few aspects actually of our approach, because I don't think I mentioned it earlier. The way that Move with HEART sessions work, so we're group-based and it's a closed group. So it's the same 10 to 12, 15 at maximum participants move through the Move with HEART journey together. And they meet every week for about 90 minutes. And we have a standardized curriculum. The curriculum is also organized around 3 themes: safety in the body, radical self-love, and compassion in action. Those are kind of the big overarching themes. And each weekly session also has like its own core idea that's brought out both through words in an introduction, and also hopefully embodied through the physical practice itself. And the content of the session, so we're integrating breathwork, mindfulness exercises, yoga poses, relaxation techniques, guided visualizations, and at the end we have this closing circle discussion where everyone gives voice to some of their experiences and hopefully affirms and validates one another. So we are integrating a lot of yoga practices and breath practices, and then there's a lot of other things happening around that as well. In terms of the pathways to healing, this is something that we are still trying to uncover, but at this point we've had research embedded into our work, and Sylvia will talk us through it in more detail since we started, since 2017. And over, what we hear again in kind of the testimonies and stories and feedback shared back by survivors in our programming is kind of points to these pathways. So positive embodiment is kind of the core thing. We're saying that the body is holding the trauma, and our key approach is focused on the body. So the ability to strengthen your awareness of what's happening inside, as well as how your body is moving in space, and staying grounded in the present moment is really, really a fundamental pathway for us. Then we have these neurophysiological changes, and this is around like regulating the nervous system, working on some of the kind of the fear response mechanisms in the brain. This is harder for us to see, but it's building on this trauma research that I touched on earlier, where researchers are actually using functional MRIs and other ways to see and detect these changes in brain and brain structure and functioning. And for us, the way we kind of tune into this is that over and over, participants tell us how they feel relaxed after the sessions, they feel calm after the sessions, they feel able to sleep after the sessions, they feel lighter. So these are all indications that they're experiencing a more balance within their nervous system and a calming effect from the practice. And then, we talk a lot about like the container that we're creating, and really trying to create a safe container with these affirming experiences through our trauma-informed facilitation. So participants really have to feel safe, they have to feel valued, they have to feel connected, they have to feel free to make their own individual choices for healing to happen within our sessions. And I think this also, you know, if we think about our community of women and girls who have experienced human trafficking, often all of these things have been really, the feelings of safety have been ruptured, the feeling of connection to self and others have been ruptured, the stigma that Mina and Eric talked about earlier. So we try to have kind of corrective and affirming experiences. And then we're teaching practical skills that can be carried back home and into reintegration and other stages of life. So then the short-term outcomes we see are physical, psychological, and social. I'm not going to read through these, but just to say that what we hope happens from this experience of kind of holistic, these holistic changes is that participants will have enhanced well-being, both physical, psychological, and social. They'll have more active engagement in their communities. And here we're kind of including family, and we've have quite strong testimonies around that. And it also, I think, Mina, you started off really talking about relationships to family. So I think there's a lot of implications here for more positive reintegration experiences. And then reduced risk of re-victimization and experiencing either being re-trafficked or further violence. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to, just a moment.
No worries, Kwan. I can just actually talk about it. I think I know what's coming next. So the next slide was just to kind of break down the session in a bit more detail. And we start with an introduction where we talk about the theme and do some breathing. And then we move into like a warm-up part of the session. Then we have kind of the more structured yoga poses. Then we have some more relaxing exercises. Then we move into guided visualizations and mindfulness practices, which is part of our relaxation, and then into the closing circle. And now I'm going to hand over to Sylvia to talk us through some of our research and learning. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Sophie. So that was a great introduction to get me through into the research component. So yes, we've done research, and we started off with a pilot that was carried out in 2020 in Uganda. And our partners were, we had the University of Alabama that was mainly supporting the research component, and then a partner organization that is Everfree, formerly called Willow. And the design that we used for this particular pilot study was a quasi-experimental study where we engaged with women and girls that are survivors of human trafficking. We targeted Willow as an organization because it's specifically working with survivors of human trafficking. So we targeted young women and girls aged 14 and above. And we took them through 3 series of research phases. We had the baseline, we had the midline, and then we also had the endline. We had both the quantitative and the qualitative. So briefly, these are the findings that came out from that pilot study. Sophie has already talked about the psychological, the physical, and the social outcomes of the HEART, of the Move with HEART program. But from this study, we realized that statistically, there was significant reduction in PTSD, in depression and anxiety symptoms among the survivors that we engaged during the pilot study. And then there was also improvement in their physical well-being. Many of them were talking about less pain. Many of them were talking about less pain. Increased energy and better sleep, because they took this as exercises that were improving their physical well-being. And then in terms of the social well-being, we had improved sense of trust, because we're talking to survivors that had kind of turned into, like, their interpersonal relationships were kind of very poor. They were most of the times isolated. They didn't have trust. So after the study, it was realized that there was an improved sense of trust. There was compassion for self and others. Sophie told us about the 3 different themes that are covered within the Move With Heart program. And then there was also social support from our core participants. Those were the findings from the pilot. However, these are not yet published. So from the pilot study, these drove us into, next slide, please. So some of the participants from Kampala, these are the voices that these are some of the things that they had to say after experiencing the program. One of the participants noted that when you do heart, you live in peace. You feel like the peace is all yours. You feel all the love is yours. You feel relaxed. Your mind is relaxed without any pressure. You start looking at the challenges that you're facing as nothing. They do not weigh you down. You get the courage from within you that empowers you to face any challenges. And this is a quote from a survivor that we had engaged during baseline. And most of them at the point where when we engaged them during baseline, they were feeling very low. They were fed up of people. They were heavy. They were feeling heavy. That heaviness comes from like lots of things weighing down on you emotionally. But at the end of the day, we had testimonies or voices from participants where they indicated a feeling of peace, a peace that they own. Next slide, please. And then this is a participant from Cebu, Philippines. I think Miss, for me, the warrior pose, because we have different poses within the Move With Heart program. So one of the poses is the warrior pose. And for this particular participant, she says, because of what I went through, Miss, you have to be a warrior. You have to be a warrior and stand up for yourself, that you will not go back to that situation again, Miss. It is more of encouraging them to stand in their own power, because that is the theme within that particular Move With Heart session, standing in your own power. And that is where they do the warrior pose. So this enables, from the participants, this enabled them to realize their own power. And according to this quote, we realize a participant saying that I'm very thankful for that pose, because it's like you have stress, you just have to be a warrior. Do the warrior pose so that you won't fall, Miss, to the trials of life, Miss. That is it. That is a quote from Cebu, the study that was conducted with the Elyson Foundation. Next slide, please. So that was about the pilot study that was conducted in 2020. Right now, within the Heart as an organization, we have a program, an initiative that is currently running, and it is called SHINE. SHINE is a sharing heart in new expanses. We are not sharing the organization, but we are sharing the Move With Heart program in new expanses, because the pilot study was conducted with a smaller sample size. Now, within this particular initiative, we are implementing or using the program with a bigger audience. So this particular study is being carried out in Uganda, and it started 2023, 2024, and we are using, we are partnering with the University of Alabama. We have Innovations for Poverty Action. We have partner agencies that we are working with. These are organizations that are supporting survivors of human trafficking. Like we have Dwelling Places. We have Ever Free Stroke Willow, Hope for Justice, Rahab Uganda, Set Her Free, and the Remnant Generation, and also UDEM. Those are the partner agencies that we are partnering with within this particular study, this 2-year initiative. But in addition to the partners, we also have a survivor advisory group. This is a group that is composed of survivors that kind of provide a survivor perspective on all the different aspects of the SHINE initiative. Because we need to take, that enables us to tailor the processes to the needs of the survivors. One recent example is in the last engagement that we had with the survivors, they advised about the reintegration. What should we do during the reintegration of survivors? And their feedback was integrated into the curriculum that is currently being used with the survivors. And the SHINE initiative, much as it is a 2-year project, but it is being carried out in a phased manner. We have 3 different phases. We have wave 1, wave 2, and wave 3. Each wave is running for 6 months. And within each wave, we have 3 different phases of data collection. We have the baseline, we have the end line, and we have the follow-up. And then within that particular wave, we have a program, the Move With Heart program being implemented. So the SHINE initiative is using the gold standard. That is, we are using, the design is for us to use a randomized control trial. So within the 6 months, after we do the baseline, we do the randomization, where participants get to be assigned either to the Move With Heart group, that is the intervention arm, or the research only group, that is the control arm. And within the SHINE initiative, we are targeting 300 participants. Previously, like I said, in the pilot, the sample size was really, really small, but for now we are targeting 300 participants. And these participants are all survivors of human trafficking. They are aged 14 and above. They are aged 14 and above, and they are all enrolled within these different agencies that we are working with. The SHINE initiative is being funded by HTRI, that is Human Trafficking Research Initiative. And there are other programs that we are running under the SHINE initiative. We have the suicide risk prevention component, the training that is provided to the counselors as they provide support to the survivors that have been referred for services. And then we also have the distribution of the reusable sanitary pads to address the barrier to participation. The findings, please stay tuned. But because we've been engaging participants in a phased manner, we have a few of the voices that we've captured and would like to share with you in this platform. Next slide, please. Okay, sorry. So these are the voices that are coming in from the experience of the SHINE participants. Like we have some of them sharing about what happened, because Sophie talked about the closing circle. So this is what some of the participants experienced after going through the session. And then we have another quotation about living in the moment, and the participant gets to share what they experienced after having that program, having that session. And the last quotation, all voice note, is I have had a hard heart all my life. Before I joined heart classes, it was hard for me to feel sorry, also say sorry, even when I was in wrong. Heart has dug up a softness in my heart and brought up some kindness in me. So that is some of the feedback that we are getting from the participants that have participated within the SHINE initiative. I pass this over to Sophie, please. Sophie?
Thanks, Sylvia. Yes, I think we can go to the next slide, and maybe we can skip this slide and just go into the Q&A. And we're happy to talk more about programmatic experiences in the Q&A or in a follow-up conversation. Back over to you, Jean-Luc. Thanks so much.
Thank you both. That was a really insightful presentation, and I think we could go for much longer, but unfortunately time is limited. And thank you for everyone who stayed on as well. There is, I think, one question which I think Jonathan's answered in the chat. It's to do with, I think Pauline is interested to know if there's sort of a time period for trauma recovery to take place vis-a-vis, you know, movement type interventions or the mind-body intervention which you've at the heart projects implemented. From our SLR, as John rightly said, unfortunately, the studies didn't look at that specifically. In fact, we found very little. We didn't find any experimental type study designs, pre-post at best. But I wonder, Sophia, I guess maybe anecdotally, based on your experiences, Sylvia, based on your experiences implementing in Uganda, I wonder whether you have any advice there on this.
We do 3 months, and I think when we did our initial scan of the literature, 10 weeks seemed to be the minimum. So that would be kind of the best that I can say, but it really isn't informed by strong evidence. It's just what I had seen in terms of other programming. Great question.
Thanks for that, Sophia. That's a very good question, and I think it also just goes to show that there needs to be more research in this space. And yeah, our SLR uncovered some nice findings, but again, I think there needs to be more. Also, I think rigor in the way we conduct these tests. Of course, more funds as well to conduct those tests in the first place. But no, I don't want to keep everyone here longer than they should be. But I do want to just make sure that there are no additional questions. As I mentioned, if you do have questions, maybe if you're still thinking about the stuff that we've talked about today, I know it's been a long 2 hours, but a lot of information. Feel free to direct your questions at us, HRC CTIP, email us, and we'll forward them on to all our contributors today. Yeah, I don't think we have any. But before we leave, I'd like to thank everyone who's participated today. Sophie and Sylvia, I think the work that you're doing is pioneering work. Inspires us to innovate, I think, and to find more holistic ways of supporting survivors in their reintegration journey. And I think it links up really well with the research that the HRC have supported us with over the years. Looking at again, more equitable, more maybe survivor-informed practices in the space that we all work in. And yeah, I think that is it for today. Thank you very much. I appreciate you attending, all of you. This, as you know, has been recorded. We will share the recording with you so you can share widely. We hope it's a useful resource, particularly sports in trafficking or CTIP space is not really something that's been talked about often. So yeah, we hope we've added an additional resource to the space which you can share. Thanks, everyone.